Good morning. Welcome to Tea, Coffee, and Torah, episode 23. I'm glad that you're here with me this morning. I don't know how your fall is going. It is gorgeous. The leaves are just beginning to turn. We're getting some bright reds and yellows. And so if you're going to make your trip, to go see some change of fall colors, now is the time to begin to think about it because it is absolutely gorgeous. I wanted to share with you some ideas regarding Israel's cultic stance, and how it differed and how it was similar to other nations. In the past 50 years, Israel's religion, and I'm going to say this is the ritual side of what is in the divine law, what is in the law of Moses or the written Torah, has really come under fire because of what is perceived to be similarities with other nations. And so far we've discussed some of those similarities. We've seen where Deuteronomy 30 really confronts the ideas of Gilgamesh. We've seen where Isaiah 66 directly hits a Hittite ritual that was very likely, my eyes are watering here in the dryness this morning, a Hittite ritual that likely stayed alive in Canaanite practices. And that was, the cleansing from defeat when you had been defeated by an enemy army. But I wanted to just share with you an overview, a very, very broad overview of some other things that distinguished Israel's cultic aspect of their religion. This would have been what the Levites would have done. This had to directly associate with either a tabernacle or a temple. Now, one thing that does not come through in the biblical text, and this is through translation, and I'm surprised that Jewish scholarship, rabbinic scholarship has not been more acute to pick up on this, because the terminology is utterly consistent. In our modern translations, the word statute is horribly misused, because in the Hebrew, the chags were something that always brought the average citizen in contact to a physical location of either the tabernacle or the temple. It always had something to do with something that is cultic. And you'll find, we'll go through this in a later study, that those are always something that are upheld by every single prophet in the Torah. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, even some of the minor prophets, you'll see that these ideas are upheld in their works. But I want to start, kind of take it back just a little bit, and just a very, very broad overview of some of the distinctions that occur between Israel and other nations. So the first one is going to be funerary cults. These would have often brought you in contact with a bama, a high place, and there was some sort of ancestor worship of the dead. Now, there's controversy regarding were the dead actually interred at the funerary site or at the bama, or were they simply, that was used as a funerary location and the body interred elsewhere. Originally, Albright came out in favor of showing, because in the biblical text, the prophets always criticize the funerary rites that are associated with the bama, or the bamot, if you were going to use the plural in the Hebrew. But you find that these locations, when they're excavated, they do not often find that they have bodies that are physically interred. Now, that one has been discovered at Megiddo, and so that may be it may just be that some of these are so buried down, or the shafts to those burial sites are so compromised that they have not been uncovered yet. But there is one at Megiddo, or at least one possible one. So the funerary cults The worship of ancestors, the deification of ancestors, is one of the primary differences, foundational differences that we find that existed in ancient Israel's religion versus all the other all the other religions. The other things that were associated with this would have been the cutting of one's flesh, tattoos, marring your skin with permanent marks on behalf of the dead. You also find that monotheism is definitely a distinction that is made in Israel. And it's not just monotheism, it's also the representation of the deity in physical form. The idea was that the deity manifested itself in many forms, and the idol was one of those forms. That is strictly outlawed, strictly forbidden throughout the Tanakh. You don't find in any portion of the text, even the portions where the documentary hypothesis or scholars are very critical, you don't find any text, whether it's in Kings or Chronicles, advocating for idol worship. You also do not find anything in the text advocating for funerary cults or funerary practices. The other thing that you find, and this is actually, I'm going to back it up again. Let me go to the Sabbath. Other ancient nations did have ideas of holy days or sanctified days, but nowhere do we find the idea of a Sabbath where you were supposed to rest and where that Sabbath is really a day off for the people. In Babylon, we find that you had days, but they were more of bad omen days. They were days of superstition. So nowhere in the ancient Near East you find that, hey, this is a Sabbath where we're going to have an intermission, and it's going to be for the people to take a day off of work. It's going to be a holiday. That is really revolutionary to Israel. The other idea that is revolutionary to Israel is this Bill of Rights that exists in the written Torah for slaves and even for bond slaves. Nowhere are slaves afforded any rights, but yet in the Torah, they are afforded rights where if the owner of that slave harms them in any way, that slave is allowed to go free. So the Torah was the very first document to establish some sort of human rights for a very, very oppressed class. Another oppressed class were immigrants. People who may have come to a better nation seeking asylum. The Torah is revolutionary in that it affords the same rights to immigrants who are in your land wanting to assimilate, and that's key, wanting to assimilate into your society. It affords them the same rights under the law as native citizens. That's another revolutionary concept. The other concept that we have that is very revolutionary in the Torah is this idea that you do not need direct an intermediary in order to access the deity. Of course, in this case, it's Yahweh or Jehovah, whatever term you use for the divine name. So you find that no intermediary is needed. And we see this in many cases. Samuel's mother, Hannah, when she comes into the temple, she's able to pray directly to Yahweh. Yahweh hears her prayer and grants her wish. Same thing with King David. There's direct access. Same thing with Hezekiah. When Hezekiah is sick, he's able to pray and access God. And there is no intermediary that is needed. So the priests in Israel never formed this society where you had to go through a priest to access God. The priests served a different function. They were more of a function of state, a function of government. They never came between the petitioner and Yahweh. The other thing that distinguished Israel's priesthood was divination rituals, where you had to bring all these ingredients to the priest, and the priest had to perform these complicated rituals to find out why you were suffering, or why maybe a relative died, or why there was sickness, or why calamities were coming upon you. Israel actually had a predetermined and a list of things that you would have done that would have affected, I'm going to say karma in your life. And sometimes it was your family's life if that sin went beyond the family. And that is found in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 through 30. You find very specific things that the person in society would have done that would have occasioned Yahweh's wrath. And all of these, there's a direct correspondence between obeying the written Torah and the calamities that would have come upon society. So you weren't just left guessing willy-nilly, what sin did I commit or what happened. You didn't have to bring large sums of money to find out what you did. Rather, you just had to return to that Torah. Or yes, sometimes you would go to the priest for a better understanding, but it was the priest's job to give you the understanding of the Torah, and what actions or what you may have done, how you robbed the poor, how you took advantage of others. And that was what would have occasioned your suffering or the calamity in your life. The other thing that we find, now I do want to mention this. I'm not going to get into it today, because the study on my part is going to require a little bit longer, and I want to be very thorough with this. But one of the things that we do find that is similar with ancient Israel are some ideas of purity. Now, the requirements of what was required for purity and that purity, let me clarify this, only has to do with when you come in contact with sacred precincts. Purity, rituals, clean and unclean, tamei, tahor, those things really had no context outside of accessing the sacred precincts of the place where Yahweh dwelt. So purity does come into play, and you do find that is a concept that is common with other priesthoods. Now, I want to share with you a revolutionary idea that set Israel apart from all other religions. And I do cover this in Yahweh Exists Volume 1. We find that when we look in of the Chaldeans, this would have been in Mesopotamia. What we find in very early society is this accumulation of wealth on the part of the priesthoods. They become the wealthiest landowners in Mesopotamia. They crowd out the individual citizen, and they compete head on with the monarchies of their day. In fact, so oftentimes it was your priesthoods that were your kingmakers. This is especially true in ancient Egypt, where the priesthoods would side with one contender for the throne versus another. So as these priesthoods grew in power and in authority throughout Mesopotamia, they displaced citizens from their land. They used what today would be called eminent domain to displace citizens. Then citizens became wards of these temple states. People would have been confined to maybe an 8-by-8 foot room. They would have been given a job, not totally unlike communism, where they had to perform this job for the rest of their lives. So they were given food, shelter, and clothing, albeit very, very limited. And these temple states became so powerful and so big that they couldn't sustain the population. There was mismanagement of land, and eventually the temple state collapsed because its ownership of property was so great that it was not sustainable, as well as the poverty of the people, the massive starvation, because these temple cults could not meet the demands of the people. So all of this had occurred. And what is also interesting, let me mention this. When Abraham, or at the time Abram, leaves Ur and he begins to go out to the land that Yahweh would show him, it directly corresponds with what we know chronologically with the collapse of Ur, and the displacement of society due to this collapse of government and this collapse of sustainability. So Abraham leaves Ur about this time, and then he goes to Canaan, and he, of course, begins to become a population in Canaan. But what we find with the giving of Torah, and this is why I do give credence to the Torah and the cultic institutions that the Torah establishes, because the number one limit that the Torah places on the Levites and on the priestly class is its forbidding of rural land ownership. This would have been arable lands. Now, historically, until our modern times, your wealthiest people throughout your land were landowners who cultivated the land and produced agriculture, whether these were vineyards, crops such as grains. Those were the wealthiest people of society. You can look at Greece, you can look at Egypt, you can look anywhere throughout the ancient world. Those who had vast arable lands and estates that produced food crops, those were your wealthiest people. And again, earlier in history, it was your temple states that engaged in this activity, and they gained incredible wealth by it. But you find that the reform that is instituted under the written Torah that Moses would have had was this huge limitation, this cutting off of a power where the priesthood, the cultic institutions, did not have access to arable lands. This completely curtailed the power they could gain and the monetary value that they could have, their ability to grow into their own class apart from the people and apart from what would have been a divine law. So these are some very strong differences that we see in the Torah versus all the other nations of the ancient Near East around 1400, 1500 BCE. Now, one thing that I'm going to leave it there with that part of the discussion this morning, because we are going to get into this a little bit further. But one of the things that I think is very, very, applicable, very relevant for our day is a discussion as to what the prophets would have had in their hands when they were writing the text. What did they refer to? So I would like, I've talked about maybe going through the high places and seeing the high places and how that archaeology corresponds to the righteous versus the unrighteous eras of Israel's history. And I think that's a relevant study, but I think there's one that's more pressing, because as I encounter more rabbinic scholarship, as I, delve further and further into academic scholarship, the documentary hypothesis, and all of the arguments that are there, before we can really criticize the text, I think it is wise to go through the actual text, whether it's Jeremiah, Isaiah, and see what original text they may have had. What did they rely on? So I think the direction I want to go with this next week, because I want this to ultimately be beneficial to you guys, give you something that you can sink your teeth into, something you can walk away with and say, hey, look at this evidence. Is this strong? Is it weak? And ultimately, this is about you having the evidence at your disposal. So beginning next week, I'm going to take this discussion in a little bit different direction. And I want to we're going to start in Jeremiah. And we are going to see where Jeremiah may have referred to the Torah, where he would have quoted from what would have been a written Torah, and then how he would have relied on his predecessors. I have advocated that the prophets in ancient Israel used what we today would term scholarship. They quoted from the Torah, or they referred to the Torah, but then they also quoted from and referred to their predecessors. An action that is very logical and an action that we would use today. So that is going to be our first step. And then we're going to eventually turn this in a different direction as well. But we have to first lay that foundation. Without a firm foundation of what the text actually states and how we can compare it, we're going to end up in left field. So along with this, every week, I don't know that I'll have it every Sunday, but at least before that daily teaching or the daily discussion of tea, coffee, and Torah, I am going to upload documents for you to refer to so that you have an understanding of what I am talking about when we join here together. And then I hope it will allow you to make some comments below to be able to interact. And I would like to learn from you. If you have insights, maybe there's something I've missed. Maybe you disagree with what I am understanding or with what I am seeing. Please post it below so that way we can learn together and we can grow. Because, you know, the ultimate in this, at least my goal and my hope of this is truth. Something that is unbiased, something that I believe that if we find truth, if we go with the evidence, that it has potential for incredible unity and something where we can really grow together. So thank you so much for joining me this morning. Next week, we are going to begin in Jeremiah. And, you know, this is something that I will do, give you a little teaser, a little giveaway. You know, throughout, scholars are really big on this and saying that, you know, Jeremiah quotes predominantly from Deuteronomy, which he does. But I'm going to also show you where Jeremiah actually directly quotes from Leviticus. So this is going to be interesting. I hope it's going to be a source of growth for all of us. And I look forward to talking with you next week. Thank you so much for joining me and enjoy a good cup of tea this morning. Shalom.